Will McMahon. I'm Director of Action on Empty Homes, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this Architects Climate Action Network and Action on Empty Homes COP26 Fringe meeting. We're taking the opportunity of the Climate Fringe Week to launch our call for action to retrofit empty homes as they're renovated to increase the supply of affordable zero or very low carbon homes. Now, my job today is basically to facilitate the event. We have an hour, and we'll be asking our expert panel to address how empty homes can play a role in meeting the climate challenge. They'll each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes or so for questions from our audience at the end. Now, if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube and you have a question, then please put it into the question box on those channels, and we'll collect them together here, and we'll put them to our panel at the end. But do remember to tell us who you are and where you're from. That really helps. So, on our panel today, we have Dr. Jo Patterson, who's Senior Research Fellow, Welsh School of Architecture, Gloria Lowe, Chartered Architect and representing ACAN Scotland, and Andy Moseley, the Empty Homes Policy Officer from the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go straight to our first speaker to kick us off, and that's Brighid Carey, Consultancy and Projects Manager, Action on Empty Homes, who's been leading our retrofit work and will introduce our call to action. Brighid.
Thank you, Will. Good morning, everyone. As Will said, we're taking the opportunity of Climate Fringe Week to launch a call to action to retrofit empty homes as they're renovated to increase the supply of affordable zero or very low carbon homes. Now, there are a number of reasons why we believe this to be important. 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the UK are operational carbon emissions from residential housing, so that's heating, hot water, cooking, and so on. And Britain has some of the oldest and most diverse housing stock in the world. The new houses going up now will become the older housing stock of the future, but very little of this new housing is being built to very low carbon standards. We must get a handle on retrofitting. We've got to get to grips with retrofitting existing homes and ensure the local skills and supply chains required are in place and properly functional. The challenge, well, the problem really, is that it's very difficult to fully retrofit a home to the extent that there will be a meaningful impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions while the occupants are in residence. Sustainable and effective retrofitting requires more than simply adding insulation or an air or ground source heat pump. The homes we live in operate as systems. We have to consider airflow, for example, to avoid condensation that can result from over-insulation, and complementary energy generation to avoid simply adding to fuel costs. We must think beyond just basic heating and energy consumption. Cutting corners can do more harm than good to the fabric of the building and to the health of the occupants. A further challenge, it's another problem, is that even where the spirit is willing, the green skills and supply chains are so often not in place at the local level or robust enough to cope with the scale of task ahead. Even if you wanted to fully retrofit your home, you would generally be hard-pressed to find knowledgeable, qualified advisors, suppliers, and installers. This is where empty homes could help lead the retrofit revolution. Retrofitting while renovating already empty homes will avoid the need to decant existing residents, saving on the costs and upheaval of vacating each home. Empty homes are just that, they're empty. Retrofitting these houses would provide opportunities for on-site training and would offer a consistent enough work stream to develop local supply chain infrastructures. The diverse nature of empty homes would help to grow a range of flexible solutions to fit the requirements of different types of housing and different household needs. We need this green infrastructure at the local level. We need skilled jobs for local people, and we need to build vibrant green economies. We're calling for financial support for owners to bring empty homes into use, retrofitting as they renovate. We need investment in local skills and incentives for local contractors and suppliers. Local authorities and local communities are ideally placed to support and enable retrofitting while renovating. They have long experience of channeling funding from central and devolved governments to deliver on the ground, and can bring to bear their combined powers of persuasion and enforcement. We're also calling for social housing providers and community-led housing schemes to take on and renovate empty homes, adding to the supply of affordable housing that is not just affordable to rent, but is also affordable to heat and to live in well. Britain is facing three major emergencies: climate change, genuinely affordable housing supply, and health, all of which hit the most vulnerable in our communities the hardest. We've seen over the past weeks how quickly and easily large numbers of households can be pushed closer to the edge. Soaring fuel costs will inevitably lead to escalating fuel poverty, especially for those living in the poorest quality, hardest to heat housing. In Britain, almost 359,000 homes stand empty, while over 330,000 people are homeless or stuck in temporary accommodation. Clearly, we need much more new social housing. However, the climate, housing and health needs we face now are urgent and immediate. The empty homes are there now, and the need to act is here now. Government-led Green Deals have yet to deliver real progress. Reliance on top-down approaches alone misses the opportunity to build local and sub-regional supply chains and skills to benefit local economies and enhance community well-being. A programme of renovating and retrofitting empty homes would create a sustainable model for the future, breaking away from big business and replacing it with integrated local and regional networks delivering whole house, whole economy solutions to the climate, affordable housing and health emergencies. As a coalition, we call on national and devolved governments to support owners of empty homes to bring them back into use as zero-emission social housing through sustained investment in low-cost loans, grants and tax incentives. To give local authorities more powers and resources to bring long-term empty homes back into use as zero-emission social housing through, for example, simplified empty homes management orders and new powers such as compulsory sale orders and compulsory rent orders. To incentivize, we're calling for the incentivization of social housing providers and community housing schemes to take on and retrofit long-term empty homes as part of their targets to deliver new social housing through a focused renovate and retrofit programme. And to invest in local and sub-regional supply chain development and green skills to rebuild local and sub-regional economies and enhance local community life. Reliance on centralised approaches alone cannot deliver zero-emission affordable housing or reverse the tide of fuel poverty. We're calling for government's intervention and funding targeted towards collaborative local and sub-regional solutions for empty homes. We call on central and devolved governments to recognise that empty homes can lead the retrofit revolution and that leadership around this should be kept local. Following Climate Fringe Week, we'll continue to discuss our call to action in the lead up to COP26 in November, where the call to action will be formally launched. We're really pleased to be working in collaboration with ACAN, and that Andy from Scottish Empty Homes Partnership and Gloria from ACAN Scotland and Joe from the Welsh School of Architecture are contributing to this event. We very much look forward to working with them in future. You can also sign up and show your support for our call to action through the Action on Empty Homes website, and periodically you'll see the link to that coming up at the bottom of the screen. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks, Bridget. And as you advertise, the call to action can be found on our screen. There's a sign-up form there. If you go to our website, Action on Empty Homes, and look for Retrofit Revolution, you'll find the call to action there. Our second speaker is Andy Moseley, Empty Homes Policy Officer, Scottish Empty Homes Partnership. And Andy will be talking about Scotland's commitment to providing more social and affordable housing, and why we need to make greater use of empty homes if we want to deliver the housing we need and also tackle the climate emergency. He's also going to set out his thinking on what needs to be done to make it easier to do this. Andy. You're on mute, Andy.
Thank you. Thank you, and apologies for doing the classic mistake of starting off with my laptop on mute. So yeah, I'm talking about how we can use empty homes to help tackle the housing emergency and the climate emergency, and just to give a kind of the Scottish perspective. So from the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership, first thing to note is really the partnership is funded by the Scottish Government, although it's hosted by Shelter Scotland. And that's important because it shows that we have a government that's committed to tackling the problem of empty homes. And we know we also have a government that's committed to tackling the climate emergency. The Scottish Government's legally committed to a net zero greenhouse gas emissions target by 2045, so 5 years ahead of the rest of the UK. But at the moment, Scotland's 2.5 million homes account for around 15% of total greenhouse gas emissions, so slightly lower than the UK average, partly reflecting the geography of Scotland, but also still obviously a very significant amount. And so to meet this ambitious target, really what we're looking at is all homes and buildings will have to significantly reduce energy use, and most will have to switch to a zero emissions heating system. But that's really only kind of half of the story for housing, because there's also meeting the demand for housing, which is another thing that the Scottish Government is determined to tackle. Housing to 2040 was published in March this year and sets out a vision for housing in Scotland and a route map to get there. The first part of this is more homes at the heart of great places, which had a commitment to deliver 100,000 affordable homes by 2032. And that's recently been increased by 10% following the SNP Green Party cooperation agreement. That's just looking at social and affordable homes. Homes for Scotland, who represent private builders, have also estimated that the country needs at least 25,000 homes per year across all tenures. And while we know that Scottish Government are developing regulations to require new buildings consented from 2024 to use zero direct emissions heating to contribute towards meeting those ambitious targets, again, that's only part of the picture, because a building that can be net zero to maintain is anything but net zero to build. The reasons for that is that there's two types of carbon emissions from housing that are contributing to the greenhouse phenomenon. The operational emissions, which is what's created by running and heating a house, but also the embodied emissions that are associated with the actual creation of the house. There's a little quote here from Circular Ecology, who noted embodied carbon emissions make up a large fraction of the emissions from the construction sector, 20 to 50% of the whole life carbon emissions of a new building come from the actual building process. And unless that footprint is included in the definition of net zero, it risks neglecting a large amount of upfront emissions. And while Housing to 2040 does have commitments to improving the construction process and reducing the carbon emissions from it, it's still the conversations about meeting housing demand dominated by building new homes. And there really needs to be more thought given to how we can use the homes that are lying empty. This graph dates back from about 10 years, but it's still very relevant about new builds versus refurbishment. The embodied carbon emissions of new builds, particularly where you're looking at that second bar along, are so much higher than it is for refurbishments. And it's estimated then, 10 years ago, that it would take several decades for a well-insulated new home to make up for the higher carbon emissions that are embodied. And that time's extended as well when the retrofitted building has zero emission heating. We believe that empty homes are the asset on our doorstep, and we're showing a reckless disregard for the environment if we ignore the homes that are lying empty. There's 47,000 long-term empty homes in Scotland, a further 44,000 that are unoccupied. We know they're not all in the same places as housing demand, and we know the condition of some may be beyond saving. But there's also certain myths that circulate around empty homes that we want to really kind of start to tackle. They're not just homes that have become empty or are taking a bit longer to do up because of the pandemic. Of the 47,000 homes, Approximately 2/3 of them have been empty for more than a year, and a large proportion of those have been empty even longer. They're not just homes in places where people don't want to live anymore. In 2020, both Edinburgh and Glasgow reported more than 3,000 homes that had been empty for longer than 1 year. And they're not just homes in places where no one is building anymore. When we looked in Aberdeen in 2019, around 80%, a large amount of the new build homes were being built in the areas that already had the highest levels of long-term empty property. And it really needs the approach of recycling, refurbishing and retrofitting, so that what we're looking at, and the same as we think about recycling anything, recycling our homes, renovating, refurbishing and retrofitting. There's a quote there from University College London fact sheet emphasising that additions can extend the lifespan of the building and help avoid the embodied carbon needed to replace an old building. But there's also evidence in Housing to 2040. Woodside Flats in Glasgow, 3 18-storey tower blocks built in the 1960s and refurbished 2 years ago. Described as a pioneering retrofit strategy, it's resulted in 70% reduction in carbon emissions. It's also helped to mitigate fuel poverty for 314 households, so contributing to these two major targets. And by retrofitting, the associated whole life carbon of these homes are closer to net zero than most new builds. It shows that it can be achieved. Through retrofitting old buildings, we can get that same net zero energy emissions, and we're saving on the embodied carbon that's associated with new builds. And we've seen this in Scotland through the work that our empty homes officers have done around the country. We've seen successful schemes where hotels, shops, breweries, schools, hospitals, other historic buildings have been converted into homes. And that helps to retain and revitalise local heritage, which is important where we have commitments to 20-minute neighbourhoods and really a sense of place, because we're not seeing homes being replaced with identical new housing. It's helping to retain the character of communities. It's also helping to retain those communities, because we've seen fragile communities sustained and revived as buildings have been brought back into use, including on some of our islands where it's been buildings for affordable housing for teachers, doctors and other essential workers, a whole new generation. And there's a third area that's really important about this, because when we sustain and revive communities, it can also ease the pressure on our cities and towns, because we can create a reduced demand for housing if we're making more use of the rest of the country. We can reduce costs and improve the quality of life for those in urban areas and outside of them. And refurbishment and retrofitting is key to this. And we've looked at measures that we believe will help to deliver the commitments in Housing to 2040 and help to bring empty homes back into use. 3 areas that we've focused on: supporting owners of empty homes to bring them back into use as zero-emission housing, looking at how we can use the council tax levy or disapplying the council tax levy where owners are looking to bring back zero-emission homes, giving local authorities powers to take long-term empty homes back into use where they've been empty for more than 2 years, where owners are making no attempt to bring the property back into use and where there is clear housing demand. And also incentivising social housing providers to take on long-term empty homes. We know a lot of the incentives at the moment around providing housing are geared up towards new builds. So we need to look at how we can address that system and make sure that social housing providers and others are able to deliver new social housing through bringing back existing buildings rather than purely relying on new builds. And all of this would add to what the Scottish Government's doing and has set out for the future to tackle the climate emergency and reduce our carbon emissions. It makes economic sense and it makes environmental sense. So that's all from my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andy. The Woodside Flats redevelopment sounds absolutely fantastic, actually. How well known is it?
It's included in Housing to 2040. It's been noted a bit. I don't think it's as well known as it really needs to be.
Okay. Well, I'm sure that we can help with that. We've had new people joining, so I'm going to tell them that if you want to ask questions on YouTube or Facebook, please ask the questions and we'll bring them together at the end and put them to our panel. Thanks for that, Andy. Our next speaker is Gloria Lowe, who's a chartered architect and is representing ACAN Scotland. Gloria is currently a director of Scottish Ecological Design Association and chairs the solar organising events and judges the Keir McGregor Award for Solar Innovation. That was a bit of a mouthful. She volunteers with Architects Climate Action Network. So over to you, Glo.
Hi, yes, I'm a practicing architect by trade. I do research with building physics to soil physics and material science, all in aid of, I suppose, our climate, our indoor climate, looking at various details. And that's what I deal with day to day is retrofitting and domestic housing as well. But here I'm wearing the ACAN hat and also talking more about the reason why we should do retrofit from the circular economy kind of point of view. And it is important to understand why we want to do something, because I think otherwise we won't even take the first step. I just like to share screen if I manage to do this again. Let's try this. So we live in a planet that is finite, and there is no planet B. And if you look at the natural world, the biosphere doesn't create any waste. So an animal eats the berries, they poop, and then it goes back into enrich the soil, and it goes round again. How we as humans use the environment, however, is mine the earth and then create waste and then throw it away. Now, a lot of people think circular economy is, oh, well, we recycle. Well, is it? If we're still taking from the earth? I would like to think of it as the other way around. If you watch the right-hand side of the screen, to not even mine from the earth and to take from whatever we've already taken out instead. There's this lovely book called The Closing Circle. Originally is called, the subtitle is Confronting the Environmental Crisis. But when it got, it's published in 1971, so this is not a new concept, it's from ages ago when Barry Commoner came up with this. When it got republished, now you can't get the original title. It's called Nature, Man and Technology, because people find confronting the environmental crisis too hard to swallow. But he was absolutely right. Everything is connected to everything else. Everything must go somewhere. Nature knows best, and there's no such thing as a free lunch. With that at the back of your mind, you can see how, as an ecologist, he sees the world. And we should see it like that too, because actually we are part of the biosphere. We can't separate ourselves from it. We are actually part of it. So recently, the Dasgupta report has highlighted the natural capital that should be taken into account whenever we do anything. The government paid for this report because they want to work out what the economics of biodiversity is, because everything is measured by economics. We realize that there's a supply and demand issue, so we need to reduce our per capita consumption, and we need to actually make it what we have more efficient. So this relates to Kate Raworth's donut economics as well, which you probably know about already, the social foundation and ecological ceiling, and we need to be, supporting all our needs whilst not exceed what the world can support. So this is really important in conceptually, because If we understand that, then circular economy is a no-brainer. Our built environment, as you know, I think you've been thrown so many statistics this morning already, is highly connected to our biosphere, highly connected to everybody else. We spend a lot of time indoors, and most of our buildings up to 2050 already exist. There is a huge amount of emissions related to construction, as well as waste. As well as that, obviously, if our built environment is no good, if it's moldy, if it's not well ventilated, or if it's too cold, whatever, healthcare costs goes up. And there is a huge amount of healthcare cost that is already related to the built environment. This is what construction industry looks like. 50% of global carbon emissions and 90% of biodiversity loss. And this is from Zero Waste Scotland. This is not my graphic. And the grey little bit down there, the 10% of recycling, we say we try to do do our best in recycling. That's the tiny, 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 tiny bit. So what do? Well, the hierarchy is to retain, to refit, and then reconfigure if you need to. So by the time you move out to reuse, remanufacture, and recycle, you actually embody more carbon in sending it back to the factory already. So the more you can just retain as is and refit it and reuse it as is, the better. And demolition basically means there's a design mistake, because it shouldn't really ever happen. So why will we do that? We need to work out what our true values are. In Japan, there's kintsugi, the art of repair, because they used to not have any pottery, ability to make pottery. They don't have the right clay, they don't have the skills and technology to make pottery. So when they have imports of pottery bowls, it's so precious that when it breaks, they'll do everything to repair it and make the broken bowl even prettier by having gold glue, as it were. And it's preserved in that way. So we would need to work out what we place value on, our culture, our society, or we use whatever product it is. The land, which is very precious, got a lot of pressure on our land, all of that. Even aesthetics. If something's not beautiful, if something is not nice, if something not comfortable, it has less value, and you're more likely to throw it away. So we need to think about what's close to our hearts. Is it our community? Is it nature? So that tiny little graphics of the building built outdoors is actually more not just about reusing doors, though it is about that too, but it's about the community that came together to build it together. Once we worked out what our values are, we can think, what, as I think Andy already mentioned, our heritage, what's significant to us, what's, there are World Heritage sites, there are, even if it's not, there's neighborhoods, there's community and social value in a lot of the existing housing. And we need to know how to preserve it, like that bowl with the golden glue. We need to work out the best way to make it perform the way we need it to be fit for purpose. And to do that takes a lot of skill, takes a lot of understanding from what materials you use, what kind of methodology of ventilation. It's never one size fits all. Of all these different buildings you see on the slide, the construction is different, the stone type is different, and the elemental, surface temperature will be different, causing condensation. When you retrofit, you've got to consider so many different things. And whilst doing that, thinking about why we do it is also very important, because there's fuel poverty. Because without doing it, people can't pay their bills. It's too expensive. You heat it, the heat escapes, and you just rack it up for heating, and you end up paying more. Or you turn it off and, go into hypothermia or something in the winter. So Architects Climate Action Network is supporting the campaign Insulate Britain. You might have heard that the M25 came to a halt earlier this week. But that's another call for the government to support this. Of course, there are many ways to do this. And action on empty homes is especially one of them. And we're really happy to support any action. The Architects Climate Action Network has the existing buildings and circular economy and embodied carbon thematic groups that are all sort of related. But happy to support any sensible action, because climate justice and climate emergency are inherently linked. And if housing and that is not sorted out for everyone, it's a global issue. As I said at the beginning, we all live on one planet. You can't just resolve it for the elite. You can't just resolve it for the middle income people. You've got to resolve it for everybody. It cannot be separated. There are some guidances already out there to help tenements, for example, to do common repairs. Not always followed too well. And there's also a new standard that come out, because in the previous Green Deals, what happened was the government paid money to contractors to do insulation, for example. They just throw it in, don't have the kind of due care, and it needs to be redone in 2 years' time because it starts to leak. They don't do, for example, the external insulation is not done well enough, so around the windows, around the gutters, so it leaks behind the insulation and cause even more problems than before they did it. It could create temperature differences that they don't realize between, say the window frame and the insulated wall, and cause extra condensation, all sorts of things. But what they want is just get the money and go. So the contractors don't really know the ins and outs of building physics or what they are doing. They just want to get on with it and, get their money and go. And the government actually paid for a lot of this kind of refits that has to be redone in short term, which is a complete waste of embodied carbon and energy and everything else to do it. As well as it really damages the industry, the construction industry, because the public then has a very poor trust record of tradesmen or of designers or of, industry as a whole. So in trying to combat that, the PAS 2035 standard has been recently launched, which hopes to raise the standards of retrofit. And it's a trust mark that delivers training to everybody from coordinators to, which could be architects, to quantity surveyors, to whoever, as well as the contractors who do the work, to understand the process, to analyze existing buildings, to give a step-by-step process in which buildings can be appropriately renovated. And hopefully that will be supported by the government to train up the industry, to make some joined up thinking so that we can deliver zero carbon homes now, so that it will last, tackle climate justice as well as emergency at the same time, And it really needs that joined up thinking from retrofitting all homes to alleviating fuel poverty that also helps with eradicating homelessness. So that's all for me.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to put a question up that we've had in from David Clare. In your view, is there ever a case for new build? Should all construction activity be focused on reuse, or can new build be more net energy efficient, / carbon neutral? Do you want to have...
That's a really interesting question. There is a place for new build, but we need to first look at how best to use what we've got already. In case of new builds, I would advocate that it should all be carbon zero now. In fact, that's our response to the current consultation for new building regulations by ACAN. Will be asking the government to try and do a step change in building regulations. They're very reluctant on doing so. But because new build housing will be the old housing in the future, so if we don't actually build it as zero carbon now, as new builds, then we're going to have even more retrofits in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. So the equation would be, we need to look at what we have now first. We need to look at fabric first retrofit of existing current stock, because it will constitute 80% of housing in 2050, and then look at new builds. And yes, because population is growing, there is a case for new build, but it's how we build them as well, and look at it as a whole equation, not, single it out.
Okay, well, thanks for that question, David. Thanks for the answer. Really interesting talk there, Gloria. Really interesting. And I wasn't being expected to be taken to pottery, but it makes the point really well, actually. It makes it really well. Our next speaker is, our final speaker actually is Dr. Jo Patterson, who's a Senior Research Fellow of the Welsh School of Architecture. Jo will be talking about her work around whole home retrofitting, combining demand reduction with energy generation and battery storage. And she says she's got some valuable case studies to share with us. Jo. Make sure you're not on mute, Jo.
Right. Can you see my slides? Can you see the slides yet?
We can see the slides and we can hear you. That's great.
Great. Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you, Will. And thanks, Gloria. That was a really interesting talk, and a huge amount of things that you said that I completely agree with you, and I think will come up in what I'm about to say as well. Yeah, at the Welsh School of Architecture, over the last 12 years, we've been involved in both retrofitting existing housing, mainly with social housing companies and local authorities. And we've also constructed an affordable energy positive new build home as well, which is also being replicated across Wales, which I won't mention today, but there will be some images. So these are just some of the projects that we've worked on. So the Salsa house is the new build, which is in the top corner there, and then the house on the right hand side is a retrofit that was an empty house that we did a whole house retrofit. We've also worked on some small commercial properties, and we do a lot of monitoring as well to try and provide evidence to the both national and local governments on what can actually be achieved. We've taken a whole building or energy systems based approach in all of our projects, which means combining demand reduction, renewable energy supply. We've just used PVs in virtually all our projects, but integrated and bolt-on as well. And we've also stored energy wherever it's been relevant. So, and obviously that technology has really moved on since we started the work 12 years ago. One of the critical things in the work that we've done is making sure that everybody is involved in the project. As Gloria's referred to a lot, people need to understand why this work needs to happen and what impacts it will, or what positive impacts it will have. And that includes everybody involved in a project, right through from the residents, if it's a social housing or local authority owned property, the owners, researchers, the manufacturers. The more people understand why the work is being done and what it's going to achieve, they will be more engaged and in the project as a whole. And we've found that in virtually every project that we've carried out. We also need to make sure that the approach is followed through right from through all of the stages of the work. So right through from planning, the design, the procurement, construction and operation. Everybody involved in those different stages need to have some understanding of why retrofit is important, because if they don't, they kind of tend to forget about it because there's always other priorities in the process. So over the last 12 years, we've retrofitted deeply retrofitted more than 20 homes. We've worked with social housing and local authorities, and we've tried to choose a range of building ages so that we can really demonstrate what is replicable, what is affordable, and what is appropriate in different types of housing. Obviously, like Gloria said, the housing really varies on fabric, on its form, on its maintenance, and also who's living in there. And decisions need to be made that are appropriate to the type of fabric, who owns the building, whether there's a need for planning, and obviously if you've got people living in there. And it's kind of really obvious that having an empty building means you can deal with each stage, particularly the planning, the design, and the construction, an awful lot quicker without having people living in those homes. So retrofitting empty properties is a much faster and therefore cheaper way of retrofitting building stock. These are some examples of the types of properties that we have retrofitted. The one property at the top, the sort of grey end terrace house, was an empty property. It was a void, and once it had gone through the whole deep retrofit process, it went into the mid-range rent bracket, and was rented out straight away. It also had a really positive aesthetic impact on the local community, whereas before it was a bit of an eyesore. So just the whole process and the positive impacts of reduced carbon, reduced energy bills, and aesthetic improvements in local areas and internal conditions are all huge benefits of retrofitting. So I'll just talk you through very briefly two of the case studies that we've worked on over the years. This is obviously a very typical Welsh house. It's nice to bring Wales into the conversation today as well as Scotland. Obviously, it's a pre-1919 solid wall end terrace house. It had very poor humidity conditions internally, very high energy bills. So we worked with Wales and West Housing to retrofit this house with a deep retrofit. And that included integrated PV panels on both the east and west facing roofs. Obviously, people usually assume that house has to be south facing, but we put it on both east and west. It works really well because it's able to generate energy throughout the day. This energy is then stored in a Tesla battery, which is located in the loft space. We've since stopped putting batteries in loft spaces because the Tesla can perform equally as well outside, and it reduces the need for access and taking up precious space, which in social housing can often be limited. We used internal wall insulation on the front facade because obviously we wanted to make sure that the house looked similar to the rest of the street, but we've used external wall insulation on the side and the rear. And we were trialing a new technology called transpired solar collector, which preheats the air, which then goes into the mechanical ventilation and heat recovery system, providing a boost to the heating, to the internal temperatures. So it was a really true whole house approach. Obviously, the house does look a lot better from the outside since the work has been carried out. And obviously, just illustrating the changes in the bills for the residents before and after, they've had an overall reduction of their energy bills by 50%. So a big change. The work itself cost around £30,000. The transpired solar collector, like I said, was a bit of a trial, which is quite an expensive element of the retrofit. So that isn't necessarily a key component. And just to illustrate the reduction in electricity and therefore energy bills once the work's been carried out, the work was completed in February 2018, and this just really shows how much the energy bills have really reduced once the work had been complete. Moving on to the next slide. So the second case study that we've worked on was with Swansea Council, and this was a row of 6 bungalows which were constructed in the 1970s. They were in really poor condition, highly inefficient, lots of damp and mold, really cold, and they were all occupied by elderly people. Their energy bills were really high, between sort of £1,600 and £1,800 a year, and they were off gas. So we worked very closely with Swansea Council and the residents and the supply chain to prepare a applicable and affordable retrofit solution. We monitored the buildings before the work was carried out, so we've got really good pre-works data to really illustrate what the improvement happened as a result of the works. And this is what we've moved the bungalows onto an all-electric system. Again, we've used a PV system on 2 aspects. We've got the Tesla battery to store energy whenever there's no generation. We incorporated a ground source heat pump, loft and external wall insulation, and some fabric changes, for example, under the windows where there was PVC panels before and huge heat losses. So again, a whole house approach to retrofitting. So the EPC ratings have gone up from a G to an A, and the SAT ratings have improved from a 12 to 95. So it becoming into the remit of the new requirements. This graph just illustrates an improvement in the internal conditions of the bungalows. So the grey and orange line illustrate temperatures before the works were carried out, and obviously very variable and dropping to really quite uncomfortable temperatures. The blue line illustrates the post-work temperatures, which are incredibly consistent, therefore providing a really comfortable environment for the residents. This graph just illustrates where the energy is coming from. The most important thing here is the blue areas, which is where any electricity is coming from the grid. As you can see, from April to September, the draw from the grid is extremely small, which therefore is really reducing fuel poverty for the residents. And then this graph illustrates how much the residents are paying, and obviously, as you can see, it's really small amount from April to September, but an overall bill reduction of 75%. So generally their bills are looking at about £400 a year, as opposed to the £1,600 to £1,800 a year before the works were carried out. And I think I've run out of time and slides, so I hope that was useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating, actually, really, really fascinating. And I think we've had 4 really interesting introductions. We've had something come in from Tom in Hawley, and it's a question I've got as well, a little bit about terms and everything. Tom says there's a lot of focus on insulation as the best way to reduce energy demand. Wouldn't just insulating homes be a more practical solution rather than retrofitting the whole house? Who would like to take that? Why don't we just insulate? What's the problem?
I think, well, if you, it's a bit like throwing a blanket over the house, and once you start insulating too much, then you start to get ventilation and humidity and problems internally with air quality. So then you start to need to bring in ventilation systems. So there is, I think whatever you do, you need to work out how the house performs as a whole.
Okay, Gloria, do you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. And I think insulate is very good. You also want to work out which bit you insulate, and how you do it. So I think just saying insulate a building is a very blanket term.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, I do whole house assessment and end up, say, for example, only insulating for a bungalow. It's surprisingly the floor and the roof is a lot more effective rather than the walls. And I don't want to do it anyway because it's a for that particular project, it's a cavity wall. I don't want to inject beads into the wall because that's really bad. It actually for moisture. So in terms of the amount of surface area, though, as a bungalow, mm-hmm. the floors and the wall and the ceiling is far more effective. So you can do insulation on its own, but you do have to consider what happens to the elements next to it, what happens to the airflow, what happens to the eaves ventilation. You know, there's a lot going on apart from just insulation. You might end up doing that to gain a significant improvement. But, you know, to get to zero carbon and to get to A rating EPC, to get to passive house or Retrofit standards, you know, just doing that will not be enough. So it's a case-by-case basis assessment. And it's not as simple as you think, you know, just sort of, let's just do this, you know, it's not always the case.
Okay, just to clarify on some terms, we've got retrofit and deep retrofit. What's going on there? Because I'm sure people will want to know. What's the difference there?
I think it responds to the question, really, is that if you only do energy efficiency or only do insulation, you're only going to ever achieve a certain percentage of energy savings, and the more you add to the package of the deeper retrofit that you go, the more carbon savings and therefore energy savings and therefore reductions in energy bills you'll get. So there does seem to be a bit of a proportional correlation between what you spend, what you retrofit, and how much you reduce your carbon emissions and reduce the bills for the occupants as well. So if you do the whole house by combining demand reduction through energy efficiency measures and provide energy through your PV panels and store it, then you can bring your carbon emissions and fuel costs down by much more.
And they're amazing, actually. And the examples you were showing, the full fuel cost savings are extraordinary, really, aren't they? I mean, I hate the phrase, but it's almost a no-brainer, really. I've got another question coming in from Kim in Preston, and I think this is more kind of Andy and Bridget. So, you know, if you can, it's very difficult. It's difficult enough to persuade empty homeowners to bring their properties into use. We're expecting a full retrofit just put them off even more. Andy, what do you think about that?
I think if we're asking them to do a full retrofit and expecting them to put up all of the costs for it, that will be a disincentive. I was looking, I can see a comment that Frank's put in, and I'd like to tie this up with that, where he said about how much is that local authorities can do to encourage retrofitting at the current moment. If local authorities can take the money that's offered that's raised through council tax surcharges, and then use some of that to provide where owners want to bring the property back to use it as kind of providing loans and grants for retrofitting, that can make it, I think, it takes away that disincentive and it actually encourages people to bring the property back into use. And you can look at how that's tied in possibly with a grant scheme where it's to provide social housing, or a loan scheme where it's other affordable or private renting housing. But tying that in, I think, because otherwise, the cost of retrofitting can definitely put people off. There is money there in what's raised from the council tax levy, and that can be used to help to bring empty homes back into use and can be used to fund, say, retrofitting schemes through loans and grants.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I think what I would add to that is that we are calling on governments to support this whole process to meet their own targets. And if we think about the last Green Deal, if you like, the one that failed earlier this year, the Westminster government put £2 billion into that. Now, we're not saying don't put £2 billion in. We're saying keep £2 billion coming in, but let's make sure that it's channeled to the local level, where that we could have those local conversations with the people who own empty homes, and have sensible discussions about it. I mean, from an incentive point of view, from the empty homeowner's perspective, I would argue that actually, if there's a low-cost loan or proportional grant available for your property to leapfrog into the future, so, if it's retrofitted, then you're done and dusted. We're not talking about bringing it back into use now, and then you'll have to spend even more money on it to retrofit it because we didn't do it while it was being renovated. There is, I think, quite a strong incentive for owners to, if the money's there from central governments and devolved governments, to act now to get your property ready and fit and compliant by the time the government changes all the rules and you've missed the boat, sort of thing. So I think a lot of it is around presentation. A lot of it is about getting the right funding in the right place and having the right conversations and making those links between and this is where what Gloria and Andy and Joe have all said. They've all addressed the why of it, and it's having those conversations about why we need to do this, and this is how we can do it, and here's some funding and some incentives to do it as well. So it's a whole approach, I think.
Okay, and we've just got a very brief amount of time now. So David actually come back with another question, which realistic cost has to come into this as well. Clients' builders don't have inexhaustible resources to spend on retrofit. Can you talk about the cost benefit curve and targeted spend? Is there a 1 minute answer to that question, or are we just going to have to leave that hanging?
I think like I said before, the quality and variability of the existing with a retrofit, the existing building, and has a huge impact on how much the retrofit will actually cost. So if you've got a very well maintained building, the retrofit will cost less because it's well maintained, whereas a very poorly maintained house will obviously cost an awful lot more to bring up to the standard. But I think the driver for all of this is going to be the change in requirements for EPC. And I mean, I know EPC C is going to be the target for England, which is manageable and quite lower cost. But in Wales, they're looking at an EPC A for social housing, which is really high. And that cost of doing that across the stock is going to be really expensive. So I think as a really ballpark, you're looking at about £50,000 to achieve sort of 80 to 85% carbon savings, which is a lot of money. But then the housing stock is getting worse and they need to be maintained in the long run. So why not bring retrofit into that?
What I want to say to that is that we're all still looking at target hitting and short-termism. Cost-benefit analysis, if you look at the long term for the planet's sake, is always worth the money. You put in the money now, get it carbon zero, and it will work forever. Building physics don't fail. Building physics you can't argue with. Once it's insulated, it'll last you. Well, you maintain the house, obviously, but maintenance is tiny fraction in compared to the retrofit capital costs. Once it's done, the long-term benefits, long-term fuel saving, long-term operational carbon benefits, it's more than your 5 years, more than your, EPCA rating, more than all of that. If you add on all that for, the umpteen years to come, I would think that urging everybody to deep retrofit to carbon zero standards beyond A rating would be the best way to go forwards, because once you've done it, it's forever.
Yeah, and that is a really good. That's a great point to end on. We have, I'm afraid, I'm going to have to bring this to an end because we've come to the end of our time. Fascinating discussion, really fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank our participants, our speakers, and our audience who've been asking questions. We've had people watching on YouTube and on Facebook, so that's really great. We're going to be having more events in the future about retrofit and unpacking the issues further, because there's obviously a lot more to discuss. We're going to be holding a global conversation on this issue with our Global Empty Homes Network in November, where we'll be discussing with our global partners from North and South America, Australia and Europe about what we can learn from each other in terms of retrofit. So I'd advise people to tune in for that one. At the bottom, you can see the website. Sign up to the call to action, go and read it, sign up to it, really encourage people to do so. And if you want any information about future events, then please contact Action on Empty Homes. You can find us on our website, our Facebook and our Twitter feed. And so thanks to all of you for taking part. Great discussion, and look forward to seeing you all again, actually. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.